Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Looks like we have about half the group. I'm glad I was able to scare so many of you away. But the pitfalls of Wagnerism, I blame the dense philosophy we talked about last week. That'll put off anybody. Let's be honest. When you're at the opera, how often do you think about the Hegelian implications of what you're seeing? Never, right? Right? So we come back to our question of relatability. And I thought what we would do today is chapter 3 of Roger's book, which talks about the actual story of the ring. Now, this is a big pitfall when you deal with Wagner. You have to look at this in terms of the plot. And of course, there's so much more to these operas than the plot. And Roger concedes toward the end of the last week's reading that one of the most important things, or the most important element here, is the music. Everyone seems to agree that what happens rises from the music. It would never occur to us to go to see the Ring of the Nibelung if it were a succession of 4 stage plays done over 6 days. That would be intensely boring. In Wagner's own time, he would read the poem or the libretto of each work to his followers before the music was ready, before he was ready for performance, before they could do a production. And people found this to be an intensely boring experience. It's like you're just listening to Wagner read his own play. We need the music to hear it. Much more interesting, another thing he would do later, once he had it scored and reduced to a piano transcription, he would play through his entire operas on the piano and sing every part on his own. So plot goes with music, and getting those separate, that you often lose something. And I think that that's a problem that every writer on Wagner has. Also, going through the plot in the way that Roger does, this is another big pitfall, because every specialist who writes about Wagner operas at some point usually feels constrained to give some long description of the plot as though you've never seen it before or weren't interested. That makes sense in the early days. And in fact, there were, even within Wagner's lifetime, there were people who were writing elaborate plot descriptions of the Ring of the Nibelung. Hans von Wolzogen, for example, one of his acolytes in Bayreuth, wrote one in the 1870s so that people would have a kind of informed opinion of what they were seeing. It would be his opinion, but nevertheless, that's what you get. I think now, after 150 years almost, we've reached a point of saturation where there are so many reliably good plot summaries of the Ring cycle and the individual operas in it that we don't really need that anymore. And Roger hints at that on the very first page of this week's reading, where he says what he wants to do here is do it as succinctly as possible, give you all the salient turning points of the drama. Well, succinct, he goes on for 90 pages in 10-point type describing the plots of the and what he thinks are important. So it's another, like last week, where he said, I don't really want to give a philosophical view of the Ring cycle, and then proceeds to write a healthy chapter about the philosophical origins of the Ring cycle. So we've got the same problem today with this plot business. He wants to go through it very carefully and highlight what he thinks is important. And very clearly, as a philosopher, what he's looking at is the philosophical dimensions of the Ring. This is a very Kantian / Hegelian reading of the Ring cycle plot. And what he prioritizes and what he comments on and what he really thinks are important are things I'll talk about first. So I'll go through that, and then I think what I'll do next is I'll talk about what I think he misses. And there are a lot of things that Roger leaves out, things that were even very important in his own life and career, and certainly in his other writing and work, that really get to the essence of the Ring, but he curiously doesn't talk about them. Again, primarily he was a trained philosopher, so that's going to be his point of greatest interest. What he seems to think, and I don't want to go through the plot at great length, it would take hours of our time, and I only have about 20 minutes to do this in. What he seems to think is most important is that the Ring cycle is about becoming. The characters we care about the most, Wotan and Siegfried and Bernhilda, the most interesting and dynamic ones, the ones who show an arc of development over the course of the cycle. These characters all at some point become self-aware in the way that Kant and Hegel believed humans become self-aware, and then proceed to become actualized and realize that the price of their actualization is their mortality. So at some point, they're all confronted with death. You could argue that Siegfried is less actualized because his death is very sudden. It's the act of a betrayal. But in the other two cases, Brunhilde and her father Wotan, the chief of the gods, actually do renounce the will to continue living because they realize that their mortality is the essential price of being alive, right? We start at the very beginning, and I think this first scene in Rheingold is, in fact, all of Das Rheingold is very important. It's a bit of a paradox because if you look at the structure of the ring, Wagner's basing this on Aeschylus's Orestia, which is a trilogy of Greek plays. This tells the story of Agamemnon and his children, the house of Atreus, and their issues of sacrifice. People who observed Wagner closely related that he would read Aeschylus every morning, as almost like a training exercise, right? To sort of get in the habit of reviewing drama. Now, when he starts writing The Ring, of course, he had in mind to write just one opera, this what we know as Götterdämmerung, which would have been the story of Siegfried's life and downfall. And then it gets magnified into this 4-opera work that tells the entire backstory. And his way of dealing with that structurally, since he's following Aeschylus, Aeschylus does a trilogy. So Wagner knows that he can't do, if you're following that pattern, you can only have 3 ring operas. And in fact, that's what they are. You have Valkyrie, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung. He doesn't even use the word opera. He considered that to be too artificial, so he calls them music dramas. And then we put Rheingold as the preliminary evening, the Vorabend. So in the literature, it's very often referred to as a trilogy, when in fact it is a tetralogy. It has 4 works, not 3 works. But nevertheless, that's what he's trying to get at, right? He's trying to get back to this Greek conception. And Rheingold's paradoxically, I think, the most important of them all. Not the most entertaining, not the greatest achievement, but the most important, because that's where we get most of the contours of this Wagnerian universe. We know who the principal antagonists are. We know who the major characters are. We know what the nature of that world is. We have the essential problem, if you follow Roger's way of looking at this idea of becoming. And the term that Roger would use for this comes from Hegel. This is Selbstbestimmung. Selbstbestimmung, he usually introduces it in this kind of Hegelian way, but then he usually uses the word consciousness to describe how it goes forward. That's not really quite right. Consciousness in German would be Bewusstsein, like awareness of self. Selbstbestimmung is something more like figuring out who you are, right? It's making sense of yourself. That this is how we look at Selbstbestimmung. And what that means, that's really quite different from just becoming conscious. Because if you're conscious, well, that's lovely, but you haven't really figured out anything about yourself. I remember growing up in the 1980s, you would hear about like dreamy people who wanted to go find themselves, right? That is an act of Selbstbestimmung. In our own culture, we can no longer really do that. Nobody has the time to go to Nepal for a year, unless you're really, really hardcore, to engage in this act of finding yourself. So we tend to do things like spiritual awakenings. Like you're an overworked venture capitalist, so you go to Tulum and have a spiritual awakening. Well, congratulations, you're awakened. It's actually a short and prescribed period of time that you have away, like a conventional vacation, if you're allowed to have vacations as a venture capitalist. So the idea of Selbstbestimmung starts very early in the cycle. It's in these first bars. You know that it starts in this low chord of E flat. We'll talk about the music next week, and Roger also has had professional quality musicianship. So the musical qualities are something we'll talk about later. But what happens in this E flat chord that starts Rheingold is that it gets interrupted. And all of a sudden we're building triads. And then of course we have the Rhine maidens come in with their nonsense language. They say words that don't make any sense. And then finally they start talking about their treasure, which is then corrupted by Albrecht. And within their conversation, we talked about last week, we talked about Albrecht as an incel, that is to say, involuntarily celibate. And there are connotations there we can get at later. He feels rejected, so he takes it out on them by stealing the gold, knowing that he can then master the world if he fashions this ring, which gives the composite work its title. And within that scene, you actually see Alberic begin to reason, and he gets a musical sample, one of these leitmotifs, and we'll talk about what leitmotifs are and how they're used next time, but a leitmotif for his self-awareness. And once he becomes self-aware, he realizes that he can master the world, okay? He can master nature, and he can then force the love, compel people to give him the love that he wants from the Rhine maidens, but that they won't give up voluntarily. If we move forward, when we get to Wotan, we realize that he's made a similar sacrifice. He has, in effect, bartered youth, life, vitality, all personified by the goddess Freya, who also represents love, for power and security. The building of this great fortress called Valhalla, which has been built for him actually by his enemies, were given to understand, for reasons that aren't explained, that the gods and the giants have fought against each other at some past time. But nevertheless, the gods have built Valhalla in exchange. They've agreed to take Freya in exchange for this. And that, of course, means the death of the gods. As soon as Freya disappears from the scene, they visibly start to weaken. Their hearts get slack, their strength goes away. In the right production values, you actually see the lights start to dim on them on stage. And Wotan's problem is to get this back using Alberic's own threat. And what you see in these two characters, very often people say, oh, they're alter egos. They're not really. Alberic is kind of like a dark shadow of Wotan, and Wotan is a light shadow of Alberic. As you go through the plot, you'll see them actually refer to themselves in these ways. It's not even self-referential, it's referential to this opposite other. Alberic will be described as or Wotan will describe himself as a Licht Alberic, a light version of Alberic, as opposed to the Schwarz Alberic, who's the terrible Alberic we know. Wotan's realization has a vast plan. He wants to rule the universe, and we portray him, initially Wagner portrays him as this ambitious, certainly, but very noble character. He wants to base everything for good. He's very much what we would like to be. We would like to be powerful people who are self-actualized, who know what we're doing, who are running things the right way. But all too often, that's not who we are at all. All too often, it's Alberic who gives us our inspiration. And we can talk more about that when I start to critique this, but to follow through with this idea of Selbstbestimmung, as Wotan goes forward, he realizes that his plans are impossible to achieve. The order of the universe, which is guaranteed by agreements he has made, depends on him obeying those agreements, right? Which is, it's itself problematic, because if you have the ring and you owe something to the giants, why can't you just eliminate them? But we're not dealing with lawyers here. As you go forward, Wotan simply can't get out of these binds that he's in. He's in these traps, which he admits in Valkyrie that he has made for himself. He's created his own problem. He can't get out of it. And his only way to do this, his only way to win the game, is to stop playing. And once he realizes that, he moves into this higher plane of consciousness where he renounces his ambitions, where he says, yeah, sure, let Alberic take everything over. I don't care anymore. And he becomes a wanderer in the mortal world. And in fact, in Siegfried, when he's identified as a character, he's no longer even identified as Wotan in the list of characters. He's identified as the Wanderer, an anonymous being who goes around and interacts with mortals, where he thinks he might find wisdom and knowledge of the world, but where he plays no essential role in any further developments and has given up on his own ability to take over power. He even gets the pleasure, in the second act of Siegfried, he has the pleasure of telling Alberic that he's out of this and that he has reached a higher plane of consciousness. You'll notice that Alberic is not included in this idea of Selbstbestimmung. He becomes aware in that first act of the first scene of Rheingold, but he never progresses as a character. The Alberic that you see there never changes. He is the same that you will see up until Act 2 of Götterdämmerung, where he appears in this dreamlike state to his own son, someone who's distilled his malevolent evil and perhaps even superseded it, because Hagen, it's not at all clear that Hagen wants to be part of Alberic's scheme. He wants to be his own evil being. He never changes. Wotan has that progression. We also see it with Brunhilde. Brunhilde is Wotan's favorite daughter, one of the Valkyries. Her job nominally is to go out and collect heroes to defend Valhalla from any future threat, which Wotan thinks is going to come from Alberic and an army of people from the underworld that he wants to get to storm the magical castle. In her self-conception, she is an instrument of Wotan's will. She even says to him, "Who am I but the instrument of your will?" That's a nice thing to hear if you're Wotan. Trust me, it's a great pickup line. Who am I but the instrument of your will? A rare thing to say. And later, it's repeated. Wotan says it back to her when it's clear that she means to disobey him. Wotan looks at her and says, "Who are you but the instrument of my will?" Like, you've already conceded your independence. This is what you do. Wotan, in that sense, he's a great baby boomer parent. He wants to live vicariously through his children, and he sees his children as an extension of himself. In my next Wagner book, there's going to be a chapter called Bad Parenting, because that's what that is. Right? It's a foolish thing to do. Bernhilde, of course, disobeys. Her punishment is to lose her divinity. She is deprived of her godhood, deprived of her magical powers, and is sentenced to be a mortal woman. A terrible thing to be. If you've already been a god, you have to become a mortal woman. And Wotan even says, "Yep, you're going to be a regular woman, and you're going to get old, and people are going to make fun of you, and you're going to sit around and spin, and it's going to be miserable." And her only concession, the only concession she can get, is that it would be the boldest of heroes, because she, in her intuition, divine intuition, knows that Sieglinde is pregnant with Siegfried, and that Siegfried will be this hero, and that through a relationship with Siegfried, she can restore order to the world. She can be the hero that Wotan really needs to save his sorry situation. So Brunhilde's self-actualization comes through mortality. When Siegfried awakens her, she is very much a creature of this mortal world. And a major distinction in the operas, the first two operas are about a divine world order. By the time you get to Siegfried, that's been conceded to the world of men and the world of mortals. It's this sort of prehistoric moment at which we stop being hunter-gatherers in the thrall of gods and start to be a settled civilization that has its own ideas and its own morals, but is still suffused with these sort of echoes or consequences of these the divinity battles that had happened before. So as you move into this spectrum, you start to see this development in Brunhilde. Siegfried has it as well. We meet him in the first act of his opera as kind of disobedient wild child. He's been raised by Mime, a Nibelung dwarf. Again, a case of bad parenting. The only point for Mime is to raise a hero who will get the ring for him, not for himself, but for him. And Siegfried has to go through this process of maturation, doing great deeds like any hero of any fairy tale. He has obstacles to overcome, a monster to kill, right? An obstacle to climb over, right? He has to kill Fafnir the dragon. He has to get through the magical fire. And he also has to awaken the princess, awaken Brunhilde. It is through this encounter with Brunhilde he learns the lesson that he really needs to learn, which is fear. Because until he's confronted with an autonomous other, an autonomous equal, a woman who can captivate him, someone to whom he can be vulnerable, he will not reach his full potential as a mortal human. And as we see in Götterdämmerung, once he has reached that, he is part of the mortal world, he is betrayed and killed, and I think Roger disagrees, but I think he reaches that moment of self-actualization after he's been stabbed in the back, after he has received that mortal blow. Then he sees very clearly what Brunhilde's love meant to him. And when he dies, and you have this orchestral interlude, this wonderful funeral march, which can provoke all sorts of emotional reactions if you're seeing a good performance. You get the whole story of his life, and not only of his life, but also of his redemption as an individual. And of course, that leads us again to the ultimate act of redemption, the ultimate act of sacrifice and mortality, Bernhilda's immolation scene, which ends the entire work. In order to save the situation, cure the curse on the ring, redeem Siegfried, redeem the gods, and allow for a new and better world to emerge, she has to take part in her own suicide. She knows that she has to die. The whole order of the world has to be destroyed. The ring will be returned to the Rhine maidens, which will break the curse. We actually get a good musical sample of that because we know that there's a curse leitmotif, which we'll talk about probably next time. The curse leitmotif always plays to completion at every moment where it's presented in the ring cycle until the very end when it's part of the final immolation scene. You hear the first few notes of it and then it stops. And why does it stop? It stops because the curse is broken. So from a Scrutonian point of view, the ring cycle is this spectacularly Kantian / Hegelian drama where major characters develop essentially as human beings, even if they are gods or semi-divine or demigods, or whatever you want to describe them as. They move through these stages of existence, recognize their own mortality, embrace that mortality, and renounce their wills to live, or actually, in a more positive sense, will their own destruction. Now, this is how he reads the plot. I think there are a lot of other things he misses. I'll start with some of my own impressions. How am I doing on time? I think I've got some time here. My own impressions, number one would be the environmental component to this. You may know that Roger was also a great conservationist. One of his favorite things to do, in fact, his favorite thing to do, was to ride to hounds. He loved to hunt. He loved to ride horses. Fox hunting's illegal in England now, but that was one of his activities. It was, I think, his only form of exercise, certainly his primary form of exercise. And he cared deeply about the natural world. This again comes out of this romantic philosophy, this romanticism in the 19th century, where nature is an essential part of who we are as people, and that its preservation and defense are very important. A lot of productions now of the ring cycle do have an environmentalist interpretation, or certainly a conservationist interpretation. Fundamentally, the theft of the ring comes across as a crime against nature. If Alberic can't abuse the poor Rhine maidens, he can certainly conduct this rape of the natural world. That in itself is suffused in myth. If you go back all the way to Prometheus and the theft of fire, this is the first real tool that we believe hunter-gatherers use to shape their existence. You can abuse nature by making it a tool of your own imprint on the world. And we have cycles now, I think, starting with Chiraud, but also going forward in time to more recent ones like Francesco Zambello's ring cycle, shared between Washington and San Francisco, where you have very clear environmental messages that the ring cycle's inhabitants, that the cast is actively despoiling the world for their own purposes. And usually by the time you get to Götterdämmerung, everything's very seedy. You see like factories billowing smoke, you see garbage everywhere, you see all the things we complain about in the TV commercials are present in this ring cycle conception. So is it an abuse of nature? Yes, it certainly is. And Roger doesn't really get into that. We also have got the characters themselves. It's very interesting to talk about Selbstbestimmung, but how often have you ever in your lives worried about your own Selbstbestimmung? Never, right? You're conscious beings because you're conscious beings. This is what we are evolutionarily or through divine spark. It doesn't matter what you believe to be the source of it. You are it, and it doesn't really demand your reflection further. What we do see, and again, I'm surprised Roger wasn't sensitive to this, is the role of very powerful human emotions. And the first one that you really get at is envy, because fundamentally, what is motivating Alberic? He's mad because the Rhine maidens won't succumb to his wiles, such as they are. He has dubious charms, if you will, but because he fundamentally envies the existence of everyone else. If you think about it, he is the lowest form of life in that universe. He's a Nibelung. He literally lives underground. He's ugly. Everybody looks down on him. He has terrible music. He's just like an awful, awful being who's to be despised. The tendency now, since we like underdogs and care about, at least pretend we care about the oppressed or whatever, is to celebrate him as a kind of a victim of abuse. He's being treated meanly by these terrible Rhine maidens, and he's become involuntarily celibate, so he's an incel. We should really just feel sorry for him. Reality was, and I think the way Wagner meant for him to be portrayed was that he's a disgusting person who represents the very worst in our natures. As we were talking about before, we would all like to be Wotan, but very often, and even Roger admits this, and Roger was one of the most generous people you'd ever meet in your life, we'd all succumb to these thoughts of envy. And in fact, the word envy, or Neid in German, N-E-I-D, is repeated constantly through the cycle. You find this discussion in, I think, every single opera. Who is envying whom? Who is causing the envy to happen? What's the motivation? And will it lead ultimately to destruction, right? So that goes on through it. We even have characters, sort of minor characters that have the name associated with the way they live their lives. The Neidings, for example, these would be the kinsmen of Hunding in the first act of Die Walküre. That suffix ing means descended from or son of. So he's the son of envy. That's what he is, right? And his actual name is Hunding. So what does that make him the son of? A dog. He's a classic son of a bitch, if you will. But his clan is called the Children of Envy. So they sound like a fun group of people. In Siegfried, Fafner lives in a cave, and the cave has a particular name, Neidhöhle, like the cave of envy. So we're always seeing this motivation. Now, I'm surprised Roger didn't talk about it, and I have a theory about why he didn't, because there were a few people in the world who were more envied than he was. He was a hotshot academic. He had his own very seriously regarded philosophical review, the Salisbury Review, at a relatively young age. He was, as even an early career academic, he had a weekly column in the Times of London. He was very popular with his students. I'm sure Fisher can tell us more about that. But he was extremely popular with the students in a way that very few university professors sadly are. And he did all kinds of other great things. He had a broad international following, which has brought all of us together. He wrote tremendous amounts of books. He had a real hero's role in his activism in Eastern Europe. He had some influence over politics and society, which most academic philosophers could only dream about, and was the target of an immense amount of envy, really up until the last months of his life, when he had his problem with the New Statesman, a misstated interview to make him look like a racist. And the whole point of it was to get him kicked out of a voluntary position on a government committee that advised on architecture. Just mean-spiritedness. And if he's left out envy, he doesn't really talk about it until he gets to the Götterdämmerung part of the story. If he leaves out envy, I think it's because he became so inured to it in the course of his life that it just didn't bother him anymore. And he didn't really think about it that much. It just became something that was familiar to him. And remember that he was writing this as a 70-year-old man. So he had had a lifetime of those slights and backstabs and all these other things, terrible things people will do to you, and was just sort of used to it. So he probably didn't feel it was necessary. Also, he had a very forgiving nature. I don't remember him ever being angry or spiteful about something one of his enemies had done. Not even like the communists in Czechoslovakia who imprisoned him and threw him out of the country. Not even the journalist who created the entire New Statesman story. He was not a bitter man in any sense. And fundamentally, one of the last things he was recorded as saying before he died a year ago was that he believed life was about gratitude. He had a very gentle soul in that way, and probably a very, 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 very kind one, certainly above average in that area. But I think leaving that out, that's a weakness if you're going to discuss the plot of the Ring Cycle. We have all of these stressors in our lives. So the role of envy is very important, right? And understanding how that works in our dynamic is something that's vital. I think I've come up on all the time I have. Fisher, correct me if I'm wrong. So we can go to a discussion.